When you grow old, if your children don't respect or ignore you, stay calm and do this. Part 1. The Passing of Time. The years had flown by. For Clara, it felt as if the calendar pages had slipped through her fingers like sand. Her children, once small and dependent, had grown into adults with lives of their own. Time had been both her friend and foe, providing her with wisdom, but slowly taking away her youthful energy. Her children, Liam and Sarah, were now in their 30s. Liam, the elder of the two, was a successful lawyer in the city. Sarah, the more introverted one, had settled down in a quiet town, married with 2 young children. Clara had once dreamed of a home filled with laughter, children running around, and the constant warmth of family gatherings. But over the past few years, something had shifted. Liam, with his busy career and growing family, had become more distant. Calls were fewer, and visits, though still happening, were hurried and brief. Sarah, while more present, seemed increasingly distracted, as though her own life had consumed her entirely. There was no anger, no bitterness between them, but Clara felt an invisible wall rising between her and her children. As Clara sat by the window one afternoon, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she couldn't help but reflect on the years gone by. She had given everything to raise her children, provided for them, loved them unconditionally. Yet now that they were adults, she often felt as though she was forgotten or, worse, ignored. It was a strange feeling. Not hatred or disrespect, but the silence of neglect. And the question lingered in her mind. Why? Had she done something wrong? Was this how it was supposed to be? As parents, we give so much of ourselves to our children, and yet, when we are older, how do we respond when that love feels returned only in passing? Part 2. The Inner Struggle. The ache of being ignored wasn't immediate. It was subtle at first, like a pebble in her shoe that slowly grew into a constant irritation. Clara didn't want to burden her children with her feelings, so she kept her frustrations to herself. But as the weeks turned into months, she started to feel a deep sadness. One evening, as she prepared dinner in her small kitchen, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Liam. "Sorry, Mom. Can't make it for dinner tonight. We're swamped with work. Hope you're doing well." Clara stared at the screen for a long moment. The words, a cold reminder of the distance that had grown between them. She put the phone down and sighed. "Maybe it's just me," she whispered to herself, as if trying to convince herself it wasn't as painful as it felt. Her mind wandered back to her own mother. Clara had always admired the way her mother had remained so calm, so graceful, even when her children were busy with their own lives. Clara remembered visiting her mother in her later years, feeling the weight of time in her voice, her presence. Yet, her mother never once made her feel guilty for not being there enough. She had always been understanding, always so patient. Clara closed her eyes, trying to recall the calmness of her mother's demeanor, and realized that this was the secret she needed to understand. Calmness was the key. But how? The following morning, Clara woke up with a sense of resolve. She had lived through enough storms in her life, seen enough heartache, and now she was facing one more. The challenge of letting go of her expectations and learning to be at peace with the distance that had grown between her and her children. She thought back to the advice her own mother had shared. When your children grow up, they will be their own people. They will make their own lives, and sometimes that means they won't have time for you. But you must learn to accept this with grace. Your love for them is not measured by the frequency of their visits, but by the freedom you give them to grow and live their own lives. Clara didn't fully understand this when her mother had first said it, but now, as she stood at the threshold of her own journey into old age, she saw the wisdom in her mother's words. Part 3. The Path to Calmness. Clara decided to embrace her own life, as difficult as it was. She began to reframe her thinking. Instead of focusing on the absence of her children, she focused on what she could still do for herself. She rekindled old hobbies, painting, reading, and long walks in the park. She started volunteering at the local library, something she had always wanted to do, but never had the time for when she was raising her children. The more Clara poured into herself, the less she felt the need for validation from her children. Of course, she still missed them, and she longed for their company, But she began to understand that her worth was not dependent on their attention. One day, Sarah called her. "Mom, I'm sorry I've been distant lately. Life's been hectic, and I've been overwhelmed." Clara's heart fluttered with the familiar warmth of love, and she smiled softly. "I understand, sweetheart. I'm just glad you called. How are the kids?" she asked, her voice gentle. "They're good. Busy, like me. I promise I'll visit soon. Take your time. No rush. I'll be here," Clara said, her voice full of calmness that came not from resignation, but from an understanding that her daughter, too, had her own life to live. That night, as Clara sat by the fire with a cup of tea, she realized that the key to dealing with the loneliness of aging was not in fighting the distance, but in embracing it with patience. The act of staying calm and doing what she could for herself, focusing on her own fulfillment and contentment, was the true source of peace. Part 4. The Call to Let Go. As the years passed, Clara became more comfortable in her own skin. She no longer waited by the phone or checked her messages with bated breath. She had learned the art of letting go. She realized that her children's lives were not hers to control. They had their own paths to follow, and she had done her best to raise them with love and guidance. It was time for her to live her own life without the weight of expectations. One day, Liam called out of the blue, his voice filled with sincerity. "Mom, I've been meaning to apologize for not being there as much. I've been so caught up in work and everything else. I don't want you to feel neglected." Clara smiled a knowing smile. "I never felt neglected, Liam. I just needed to learn how to let go and let you live your life. You're doing great, and I'm proud of you." Liam was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm learning that too, Mom. It's hard to balance everything, but I'll try to do better." Clara nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know you will. But remember, you don't need to do better for me. Just take care of yourself. That's all I want." In the end, Clara realized that staying calm was not just about accepting the neglect, but about finding peace in the absence, knowing that life had its natural ebbs and flows. The most important thing was to trust that in time, the love they shared would return, not in the form she expected, but in a way that was uniquely hers. And as Clara sat on her porch in the twilight of her years, she finally understood the wisdom of her mother's words. Let them go, and you will find that they always come back in their own way. Clara smiled, content and at peace. She had lived a life full of love, and that love she knew would never fade.